don't tell anyone, but it's actually the end of 2024 now. And I can share with you my top 10 reads of 2024 because it's the end of 2024. I mean, no shade to all of my booktube friends. I love you guys so much. But the whole trend of starting our top 10 books or top reads of 2024 in like early December always blows my mind a little bit because I do a lot of reading the last month of the year, and oftentimes December is the month where I give myself extra time to dig into some books that I've been really wanting to read over the year and maybe just haven't gotten to. And so it always amazes me when I see all of these top books of the year videos going up in like early December, and there's still 2, 3, or even 1 week left of the year, and I'm like, but what if you read your favorite book of the year at the end of December? Then what do you do? Now, I'm just playing with you guys because I have a lot of friends that do this. No shade, I just think it's really funny. All right, guys, so I finished the year. I have my stats on a very official post-it note here. 100 books read. I read 33,386 pages. I listened to 76 hours and 7 minutes of audiobook. Can we just pause a moment and appreciate the fact that I listened to almost 80 hours of audiobook this year, which for me is absolutely unheard of. I'm not an audiobook reader, you guys, and I am so excited that I actually managed my goal of listening to more audiobooks this year, and I had a fantastic time doing it. So I just wanted to have a moment for that particular stat. And the last one is that my average rating for the year was 3.71, which honestly is pretty normal for me. I am a little bit of a curmudgeon when it comes to ratings, and I am a little bit more stingy with those 5 stars because honestly, I try to reserve those for the books that really leave a lasting impact on me, that, you know, I'm reading the pages and I know I've read a new favorite, or it's just so mind-blowingly good that it deserves nothing other than 5 stars. Feel free to share with me your top 10, your top 5, your favorite book of the year, whatever you want to share down in the comments below so that I can go through and see what you guys all enjoyed reading this year. But with no further ado, we are going to get to the first book on this list. And those, of course, are the honorable mentions because this wouldn't be a BookTube favorite books of the year video without some honorable mentions. We have to, right? It's just an obligation at this point. The first one that I'm going to mention is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. I read this book this year for my 33rd birthday, my Hobbit birthday, and you might be sitting there going, oh my gosh, Tori, why is The Hobbit not in your top 10? How is this book an honorable mention? Hear me out. So when I laid all of the books out on the floor to look at them and try to rank them and figure out how I felt about them all, this one I kept pushing off to the side because I was judging all of the other books based on my enjoyment, the character work, the plot, the writing craft, all of these different kind of logistical things. And I kept coming back to The Hobbit and going, I don't know how to rate this book against all these other books, because to me, this book was just an experience. It was more than just the character work and the plot and Andy Serkis's narration of the audiobook and the nostalgia of Tolkien's world. And I just didn't know how to place this against any of the other books that I read this year. And I knew that The Hobbit was just kind of in a special place all its own. Even though I've never read it before, I absolutely loved this book. I had a fantastic time reading it. I love it so much, and I'm very glad that although I didn't grow up reading this book, that I was able to grasp just a little bit of that whimsical nostalgia that everyone always talks about. My second honorable mention for 2024, and man, you guys, these last few books at the end of the list were so hard to rank, but my final honorable mention for this video is going to be The Sword of Kaigan by M.L. Wong. This is a very, very popular indie fantasy favorite, and after reading it, I can completely understand why. M.L. Wong really wrote this book and said, how many deep and impactful themes can I pack into a single volume of literature? And the crazy part about that is she pulled them all off, in my opinion. The only criticism that I had of this book was really that there was a secondary storyline that kind of went back in the past a little bit that I felt really didn't fit the tone of the rest of the story and actually took away from my enjoyment of what was happening. And where I really felt this book shone was outside of that secondary storyline. And I actually feel like this book would have been the easiest 5-star of the year if it hadn't had that second storyline. This book was an incredible story. It had me crying multiple times. It has some incredible themes in it and definitely deserved its spot in the honorable mentions. My top 3 books in this list are definitely in a league of their own, but everything 4 through 10 could shift a little depending on the day. So I did have a really hard time ranking these, but we're just gonna go for it because I think this is about as close as it gets. Number 10 is Lightbringer by Pierce Brown. I can't tell you guys how much of a struggle this series was this year. If you've been following my journey through the second half of the Red Rising series, you will know it's been a trial and a half. Lightbringer is the final book in the series that is currently available. We have one more to go with Red God that isn't available yet. I struggled so hard with Iron Gold and Dark Age, and I was afraid to read Lightbringer after the experience I had with both of those books. But Lightbringer was promised to me as a return to form, and it really delivered. My characters were back. I felt like I suddenly could connect with the heart of the story again. I feel like Pierce Brown really found his footing and direction in the series again, and it was so good to be back with the crew. You guys, like, I love these characters so much. Red Rising is one of my favorite series of all time, and I was so afraid that Lightbringer was going to let me down, and it didn't, and I'm so glad that it didn't. I think Pierce Brown's writing improved exponentially between Dark Age and Lightbringer really had a lot of the elements and spirit of the original trilogy in it, and that's why it managed to jump into the number 10 spot on my list for the year. Number 9 is Nomads of the Sea by Kobe Zucker. This is the least well-known book out of anything on my top 10 list, and that honestly is a tragedy. Nomads of the Sea is a standalone fantasy novel. It's a little bit of a chunker, but honestly it is so easy to read. It is not dense, it is not difficult to immerse in at all. This is the story of a war that takes place in an archipelago that is populated by a bunch of tribes, and they are kind of at civil war with each other, and a industrialized military from another country comes in and gets involved, and we follow 3 different POVs through this story. One is the son of a chieftain in one of the tribes, one is a young woman who comes to be with the military from the industrialized nation. The third POV is a washed up veteran magician who's had his power stolen from him and has been cast out and rejected by the government that he once fought for. It is very rare for me to almost equally enjoy every POV in a fantasy novel, but Kobe Zucker really pulled it off in this book, and I cannot believe that this book does not have more reviews, more readers. This is a book worth putting on your TBR. If you are a fantasy fan, if you enjoy military fantasy with character focus, really interesting magic system and world building, and phenomenal POV narratives, you need to put this on your TBR because it is an absolute travesty that more people have not read this book. I want to give a huge shout out to my good friend Kayla from Kay's Hidden Shelf for finally getting me to read this book this year, because she was absolutely right. Everyone should listen to Kay's opinions on books because she knows what she's talking about. Book number 8 is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This book was one of my biggest surprises of the year, and I went into it pretty blind. The only thing I knew from my friends on BookTube was that the book is better when you don't know anything going into it, and I completely agree with that. Piranesi, the atmosphere and the beautiful writing style that Susanna Clarke uses to bring this magical realism world to life is really breathtaking and had me taking a step back and really slowing down and saying, wait a second, I need to just slow down and appreciate this book because it's so good. The twists and turns through the story were really intriguing and had me second guessing everything I thought I knew. I think the hype for this book, I know it's been a big booktube favorite for the last couple of years. I think it's very well deserved, and I highly recommend this book. It's not a slow read. It's a very light, easy palate cleanser book, but it's a book that demands to be savored in a very subtle and soft way. And I love it for that. And I really appreciated this book and cannot wait to reread it. Book number 7 is Song of the Beast by Carol Berg. I read this back in May, and this was a recommendation from my friend Casey over at Bookishly Bookish. And I had never read Carol Berg before, but I have been seeking out authors, female authors from like the early 2000s and before to read a lot of the books that seem to have kind of fallen by the wayside in our modern fantasy readership culture. This is a book that should be on everyone's TBR. You're going to hear me say that a lot through this list, but honestly, you guys, this is a standalone fantasy, and the protagonist is a tortured bard character who inexplicably was thrown in jail because of something he did, which he doesn't even know what it was, and has had his power basically drained from him, and he's maimed and he's broken. When he finally does gain his freedom, he is haunted by danger, and the people that threw him into prison the first time are back on his trail again, and it is time for him to seek out answers and find out what exactly his crime was. This book has an incredibly fresh take on dragons. Dragons are something in fantasy that often feel very samesies when I read them, and I'm not actually the biggest dragon fan, which is probably weird as a fantasy nerd. But this was a very interesting take on dragons, and I thought it was really well done. The protagonist is phenomenal. Aidan McAllister is just fantastic as a narrative character, and Carol Berg's world building and all the things that she manages to pack in such a small standalone fantasy is really remarkable. I loved this book, and this is another one that I cannot wait to reread. Book number 6 is Blood Song by Anthony Ryan. You guys know that I love me a coming of age young warrior tale, and I also love a story that follows a character through multiple stages and years of their lives, and I got all of those boxes checked with Blood Song by Anthony Ryan. I completely understand why this book is so beloved in our fantasy community because it is phenomenal. It's so good. Valen is an excellent protagonist. We get a motley crew that kind of grow up together through this warrior school that's fraught with danger and threatens their lives as they're just trying to learn their trade as basically cold-blooded killers. And it follows Valen throughout a longer period of time and gives us a chance to see how those initial events in the first half of the book really shape who he becomes as an adult. And I love stories like this, and Blood Song really delivered on so many of the things that I love about this type of fantasy. Something I said in my dedicated review for this book that I think is definitely worth mentioning again is the fact that this book takes a young protagonist and keeps the atmosphere and the story epic adult fantasy. And I love reading books like that where having the young protagonist doesn't make the author fall into the trap of writing something that feels a little bit more juvenile. This is adult epic fantasy at its finest, driven by a fantastic, layered young protagonist. Book number 5 is Daughter of the Forest by Juliette Marillier. I had the absolute honor of interviewing Juliette Marillier on my channel this year, and I absolutely loved the discussion that we had. One of the things that struck me immediately about Daughter of the Forest when I read it was the atmosphere. Marillier's work has a dark, folklore fairy tale vibe to it that is incredibly character focused. And it's a type of fantasy that I don't read enough of, to be perfectly honest. She gave me almost similar vibes to someone like Patricia McKillop, who I also read this year with Forgotten Beasts of Eld. But I felt like this story was much more grounded, and it deals with some very heavy themes in a way that is incredibly responsible and nuanced and honest, and I appreciated that about it so much. This is the story of Sorsha, who is a young woman who has 6 older brothers. When her father remarries a really terrible woman, her brothers are placed under a curse that turns them into swans, and Sorsha is the only person who can break the curse and return her brothers to their original forms. Now, on the surface level, that sounds like a very basic folktale premise, but the way that Juliet wrote this and gave it a dark twist and really gave us an internal exploration of Sorsha as a strong female young protagonist in a fantasy world is just absolutely mind-blowing. I really loved this book, and I feel like it opened my eyes to a completely new subset of fantasy that I can't wait to read more of. Book number 4 is Lord of the Flies by William Golding. I'm honestly surprised that I loved this book as much as I did. Going into it, I knew that it was probably going to be something sort of in my wheelhouse, but I was absolutely enthralled by this book. I could not put it down. It was so dark and so gripping. This book takes the idea of a kind of middle grade survival story and just pushes it as far as it possibly can. It is a classic for a reason, and the exploration of nature versus civilization and what would we do really if left to our own devices, and are children as innocent as we always claim them to be. And I mean, the theme list in this tiny little book is just mind-blowing. The number of times this book made me stop, back up, read again, pause and think. As soon as I closed this book, I was ready to open it back up and start from page 1 and read it again, which is always a really good sign because my brain is very focused on my next read. So anytime I have a book that makes me stop and want to go back and read it again that quickly after finishing, it's a book that is well deserving of its spot on this list. So what I'm going to do with these top 3 is I'm going to tell you guys about all 3 of them, and then I will announce at the end which one was my book of the year. So the first one in my top 3 is Iron Prince by Bryce O'Connor. Iron Prince was a foray for me into progression fantasy, which is something that I've always been a little bit skeptical of. I wasn't really sure if I was going to be able to find a book in that subgenre that really spoke to me, that was character driven enough, that didn't get bogged down in the stats and the details. And when I tell you, this book single-handedly wins the hardest to put down of the entire year award, I'm not joking. I loved my time with this book. I blasted through 1,000 pages all in a few days. I couldn't put it down. It was so accessible. It was so easy and bingeable to read. This is a science fiction cyberpunk progression story. Our protagonist in this story is Raiden Ward. He is an orphan. He has dealt with a really debilitating illness since he was born, and he is kind of working his way through his school experience and trying to get strong enough and smart enough to try out for a combat assistance device and get into a prestigious military school. Now, what's cool about Ray is, unlike a protagonist like Darrow from Red Rising, Ray does not start at the top of the class. In fact, Ray doesn't even start at the bottom of the class. Ray is so far beyond the bottom of the class that he's like stumbling along trying to see the end of the bottom of the class. He's so far behind his peers that he has to work doubly as hard and lean on his long history of pain tolerance and pushing himself to the absolute unhealthiest degree to try to catch up. And what I love about this story is not only do we have an unlikely protagonist who is an underdog of underdogs. But it also doesn't portray Raiden as a perfect hero. He is really struggling to see himself as human almost through this story, and we get a little bit of a glimpse inside his determination and the unhealthy habits it's caused. So there's a depth to this story that I really loved, and also, of course, it wouldn't be a favorite without a phenomenal motley crew of characters. The relationship between Ray and his best friend Viv and the other characters that they meet throughout the story, I haven't fallen in love with a group of characters that hard that fast in a very long time. And I absolutely love this book. I immediately dropped my TBR to read book 2. I am awaiting book 3 very impatiently, and I cannot wait to read it. I love, love, love Iron Prince. If you've been looking to try progression fantasy that is very character focused, where the stats do not overtake the story that's being told, this is a phenomenal starting point for you. The next book in my top 3 is Men-at-Arms by Terry Pratchett. I have done a deep dive on Terry Pratchett this year. He was my most read author of 2024. And Men-at-Arms is book 2 in the City Watch series that takes place within the larger Discworld. And the City Watch is a group of hapless soldiers led by this very gritty hero named Sam Vimes. Terry Pratchett is an absolutely brilliant author because he's able to take a lot of very human, very deep themes and weave them together with humor that's actually funny. And I think when people talk about the Discworld being funny, it's not that it isn't, but I think that labeling it just as a funny fantasy series does it a real disservice, because there is a depth in these books that I think is often overlooked that I absolutely love and have been drawn to over and over again in the 6 books of Terry Pratchett's that I've read this year. These books contain stories that can only be written by somebody who knows fantasy so well and loves it so much that he knows how to make fun of it. The characters in the City Watch are some of my favorites of all time. The motley crew of soldiers that we find in the City Watch as it expands through the series is just absolutely delightful. And Men-at-Arms was the book in the series where I knew I was reading a new favorite author and reading a new favorite series. Absolutely love it. If you've been hesitant to get into Discworld because you're worried about the humor, this is your sign to start, because honestly, I love this series, and I'm not a big fan, typically speaking, of humor in my books in general, not just fantasy. And Terry Pratchett is an absolute master of comedy with a lot of depth and heart. The third and final book in my top 3 is By Blood, by Salt by J.L. Odom. When I picked up this book, I knew that it was an epic military fantasy. That was about all I knew about it. J.L. Odom was a completely new author to me. She's a very new author on the indie fantasy scene. And there's a feeling you get when you've been reading a bunch of books and you've been having a good time and you pick up a new read, and within a few pages, you get the feeling that you are in the hands of an author that you can trust, and you know that you've got your hands on something really special. In this story, our main character, Azetla, is from a race of people called the Meshevi, and they are heavily oppressed by the Marawan culture that they are now living in. And Azetla is a debt soldier. He's a soldier who's basically indentured to this squadron. Azetla's battalion is sent into the desert by the Emperor to basically capture something called a Sar Devil. Now, we don't really know what a Sar Devil is, we don't really know what's in store, and honestly, neither do the soldiers that are looking for it. All they know is that they better be armored up and ready for anything. Now, when the battalion finally catches up to what they're looking for, they discover that they are in way over their heads, and an entire explosion of the plot happens. This is the kind of book that you have to slow down and savor, and that's what I loved about it. It inspired me to start annotating my reads. It made me really dig into the characters. J.L. Odom's character work and the arcs through this story are simply incredible. She is such a gifted author, and I cannot believe that this is a debut novel. But also I know that she's been working on it for a really long time, and you can tell. This is a world that feels lived in. You can tell that it's written by someone with a love of and experience with languages and different cultures. It's so rich. It's such a rich, beautiful story with so many different things to explore in the themes, in the characters, and the world itself, that this was an absolute pleasure to read. All right, guys, now that I have told you my top 10 books of the year, it is time to share my number one book of the year for 2024. It was actually very difficult to choose the one that was going to stand out above all the rest, because my top three, like I said before, were all so close. However, there's only one book that led me to an all-time new favorite author, that led me to a series that I am sure is going to be on my favorite series list next year, and has just made me want to go back to this world over and over and over again, and that is Men-at-Arms by Terry Pratchett. This is my book of 2024. I absolutely love, love, love this book. I am so glad that I finally got into Discworld this year. I have had the absolute best time with these characters, and I would love to see any of you who haven't tried Discworld yet to try it. And of course, my obligatory statement with this is, if you do decide to try the City Watch books, please check out the audiobooks that are narrated by John Culshaw, because they are S-tier audiobook content. Single-handedly made me a believer in audiobooks this year, and they are, in my opinion, the best way to experience these characters. Thank you guys so much for coming along with me for all my reads this year. Thank you for your comments, your support. I have loved hearing what you guys are reading throughout the year, and again, I would love to hear down in the comments what your favorite books of 2024 were, and I am just really excited to see what 2025 holds, and I wish all of you a fantastic, happy new year full of amazing 5-star reads, and I'll see you in the next video.